Thank you so much, Kat. Hi, good morning, good afternoon. Not sure what time I'm on already. I will figure out what I'm doing. All right, so thank you so much, everybody, for being here to learn more about library and archival exhibitions. I am going to turn my camera off once I start presenting, but I wanted you to see my face and say hello to everyone. And I will come back on at the end for Q&A if I have not moved all of my buttons. All right. So as Kat said, my name is Lourdes Santa Maria Wheeler, and my pronouns are she, hers, ella. I am currently the exhibition director for the University of Florida Libraries, a position I started over 10 years ago as the first person here to fully dedicated to building and managing an exhibition program. I am proud to be a first-generation Cuban American, which informs my personal, creative, and professional work. I work at the intersection of the GLAM sector, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. And I like to take the best of each area and adapt best practices to fit specific needs. So you'll hear me refer to different practices from each discipline throughout the day. I also use the words exhibit and exhibition interchangeably. Please don't worry if you hear or see a different word, I mean the same thing. What is an exhibition? My definition is that first and foremost, it's a story. And stories have three main components: a who, or the characters, a where, the setting, and a what, the plot. Because I work in an academic institution, I also often say that exhibitions are scholarly. And really, all this means is that they have been researched and peer-reviewed. It also means that I push for them to be counted for students, staff, and faculty in their annual activity reports, promotions, and tenure. I encourage exhibition curators to be storytellers, and storytellers should be engaging. Displays are very similar, but they lack context, narratives, and interpretation. While displays may be grouped thematically or even curated, they are not exhibitions. I am not saying displays are bad or shouldn't be done. There is definitely a value in them, but it is different from an exhibition. Displays often stop at the surface, such as books by Latinx authors or this year's award winners, or items published by local authors. They do not tell stories. So here we have an example of a library display and a library exhibition. The display on the left is divided into sub-themes, but tells us nothing beyond that the books relate to Latinx heritage. The display is attractive and it's accessible to visitors and highlights the collections. On the other hand, the exhibition on the right tells a story of insects represented in children's books. It discusses the role and value of observing and preserving the natural world's smallest inhabitants. Like the display, it is also attractive and highlights the collections. Exhibitions and displays have a lot in common, but exhibitions take displays a few steps further. They add additional layers and additional information. So why should we go beyond displays? Why should we take the extra work, extra time to research, to curate, to present an exhibition? Well, exhibitions can educate visitors on almost anything they care about, or maybe they don't even know they're going to care about it. In the case of an academic library, education is literally the mission. Exhibitions can raise visibility and awareness of collections. They can connect those collections to current events and contemporary issues. They can share new findings, new acquisitions, and new relationships among items. And exhibitions can broaden your audience. Of course, they can showcase unique or rare objects. And exhibitions can complement other events and activities, such as conferences or local festivals. In short, they're another way of communicating with the public. Along those same lines, online exhibitions can broaden your audience even more. They're a good solution to including fragile items that maybe can't be on physical view for an extended period or even at all. It can also allow for viewers to zoom in on details that may be difficult to see in a physical exhibit. Online exhibitions can also allow for additional content and links to other resources, even those not at your own institution. For example, you may want to include videos of an author reading, the full contents of a book or manuscript in a digital collection, performances, both the front and back of a photo or postcard, or one of my favorites, oral histories. And of course, online exhibitions can be up for a much longer time period than a physical exhibition. Now, note that I didn't say they are permanent. Even though we like to believe that things online stay there forever, we know that that's not always the case. Technology changes and information can become outdated. So the system you use to create or host an online exhibition may no longer function in the same way or even exist in a few years. So online exhibitions, long-term, but not forever. In the case of the X-ray you see here, the online exhibition where it was featured allowed us to show the various medical procedures that this Korean Bodhisattva statue underwent in order for researchers to understand it better. In the online exhibition, we included this X-ray, as well as CAT scans and an endoscopy that reveal insights into the statue's construction, as well as the presence of sutra pages in the head cavity. Personally, I love the X-rays because if you look at it closely, the crinkly thing you see inside the head resembles a brain. While it's a wooden statue, it was not a brain, and those were the sutra pages that were consecrated inside of the sculpture. Once you've decided on an exhibition rather than a display, how do you make a better exhibition? Some factors that help are innovation, presenting items or subjects in an original way, easily understood. That means that the exhibition can be easily understood by a wide and diverse audience. Easy to understand does not mean simplified or watered down. It means language that is straightforward, not technical or industry specific. Engagement. People like to look at things that are visually pleasing and can spark imagination or conversation. Items are more than decoration, though. They go beyond book covers and beyond surface beauty. Better exhibitions are also scholarly. There is research into the storyline and the objects themselves. And collaboration, whether that means internal collaboration, external collaboration, or both. Some of the best exhibitions are joint efforts where different perspectives come together to tell a unified story. For consistent exhibition standards and procedures, institutions should establish comprehensive policies. Here is an excerpt of the policy I developed at the University of Florida. Before my position was created, the library certainly had exhibitions, but really those had more in common with displays. The exhibitions that used to be presented were only for special collections materials, and only collection curators in that department could curate exhibitions. They provided little context or storytelling beyond what one would often find on a book jacket. They were also one-offs that were treated as a standalone thing, and they weren't integrated into the university or the community in any way. So these were some of the primary areas I focused on to take a more programmatic approach to exhibitions. Now, these are specific to the institution where I'm at, and they may not work for you, but some things to consider when developing a policy or even thinking about your next exhibition is who can curate those exhibitions? Who will be the curator? Can it only be internal to your library, your archive, your institution, or is it available to outside groups? For me, this one was a very important distinction because I wanted to make it so any employee of our library could curate an exhibition. It was not only faculty librarians, because at UF, librarians are considered faculty status, and I didn't want it to be an exclusive thing. This automatically increased the diversity of topics and materials that went on view. Outside groups, students, university professors cannot curate exhibitions in our spaces without a library person on the curatorial team. So that's what I mean when we talk about collaboration in developing exhibitions. Who's going to be on that team? And then what is your policy on borrowing items for exhibitions? Does your institution have individual insurance that would cover borrowed items? Do you have an approved facilities report to facilitate the borrowing of items, such as the ones that the American Alliance of Museums or AAM requires? Some of these documents really provide critical information and confidence, both for the loaning and the borrowing institutions when exchanging items. And then what's the process for proposing and scheduling exhibitions? Like, what are the actual steps from start to finish? Is there a planning and approval committee? Is it just one individual? For me, usually collection managers and librarians have a general idea of an exhibition they want to propose. Sometimes it comes from campus faculty who already heavily use our materials and collaborate with subject librarians. And sometimes some of the student employees that work with us are researching a topic for a course or are really interested in something, and they work to develop that further. So together with the acknowledgement that exhibitions are a large time commitment, is establishing a timeline for everybody involved. And the purpose of this is really twofold. Curators are set up for success in project management, and it helps all of those who may be affected by the work, such as a conservation department, a digitization department, communications, fundraising. And then, of course, in my case, my department, the exhibitions team. Once an exhibition is approved, I customize this timeline for each curating, indicating firm deadlines. And I have found this to be super helpful in keeping everyone accountable. For some of the smaller exhibitions that are perhaps just one vitrine or two, I make a more condensed timeline. So as you can see, here we have something that can take a year or two to develop. Sometimes it's much less, 3 months, 6 months, depending on the size of the space. Another benefit of the timeline is actually that now my colleagues and administration are very aware of the amount of time a good, better, wonderful exhibition takes. I no longer have curators or administration wanting to do an exhibition for a specific event or a specific donor who may visit in a short turnaround time. I don't get those requests anymore of, oh, this department is their anniversary next week. Can we put up an exhibit? I'm sure some of you have gotten that before. Doesn't mean it doesn't come, but I like to establish that to do a good exhibition, it's going to take time. And then as well for planning things like grant purposes or fundraising, you already have a built-in timeline for everybody knows this is how long this is going to take. For us, since so many different departments, individuals, people can potentially be involved in an exhibition, I developed this roles and responsibilities matrix as well. So I found that it's extremely helpful to set up clear expectations from the beginning of who is responsible for what. So for example, my staff and I are similar to peer reviewers for an academic journal or a book for all the interpretive text in an exhibition. And although we are more than likely not familiar with the specific topic of an exhibition, public history and engagement is our area of expertise. Now, this could be an area of contention for curators, especially later career academics who don't like to be edited in their writing. But our roles have all been discussed and agreed upon at the beginning of any exhibition with this guide. It's also really helpful for when we have individuals outside the libraries or first-time curators on the team to visually explain everyone's responsibilities and expectations from the beginning. It makes it a much smoother process. And so obviously this is for a very large institution, and many of the roles are specific to UF and myself. But it gives you an idea of laying out that groundwork at the beginning to make it smoother and easier for everybody involved. So libraries and archives have some unique challenges in exhibitions. And for the most part, that involves that we exhibit textual documents. Books on display include pages full of text, while manuscripts often feature faint or illegible script. These are not things that immediately attract attention from an audience, right? And then if you have to add a label with identifying information, context, interpretation, and suddenly your exhibition is filled with way too many words. The result can be really uninviting for a visitor. Your viewer is left with no clear idea what information is most important, and it can become overwhelming. For a librarian with little to no experience with exhibition design, public history, or audience engagement, this is also a really daunting process. So as you begin, some guiding questions to consider before you even start research, before you even do anything else, is what are your goals and desired outcomes for the exhibition? What story do you want to tell? What distinctive collections or objects do you want to showcase? Are you building a story around something specific in your collection or in your community? Are you even the right person to tell this story? And then if not, who is, and how can you collaborate? The principles of diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusion, and justice should guide exhibition planning at all stages. This means that although curators may be well-intentioned and have a research topic thoroughly, they may not be the appropriate person for the subject matter as an outsider to it. In those cases, curators should collaborate with communities or individuals whose story is being told. So for equitable interpretation, first-hand engagement is preferable, not just second-hand research. Every exhibition needs a big idea. Without a big idea, exhibitions are often confusing and overly complex. There's too many labels, there's too much text, there's too much going on, and things don't necessarily relate to each other. A big idea is like an elevator speech. It is one complete sentence, not a run-on sentence, that explains the exhibition. That sentence has a subject, a verb, and a so what or who cares. And so when I say this, people think I'm callous or rude, but this is the number one question I ask to develop better exhibitions, is who cares, right? Who cares that the book won an award? Who cares that this individual was famous? Who cares that the author signed the book? Who cares that it's a first edition? Who even cares that the event took place? Your exhibition should really make your visitors care. Always think about your visitors and how your big idea is going to guide everything you do in the exhibition. So to develop that big idea, you're going to want to use active verbs. I have an example here of 4 verbs. They're not really active. They all really say the same non-specific thing, right? Reveals, highlights, shows. Those are all really synonyms of each other. Celebrates, honors. Those are kind of the first jump off points that curators really like to go for, but they don't say anything. You have to think beyond that, be really specific in what you want your big idea and your exhibition to be about. So thinking about big ideas, here are 2 examples that I have really received over the years of the big idea for an exhibition. One is a big idea and one sort of isn't. They can all be improved upon. So the one on the right technically qualifies as a big idea, but we can really still make it clearer. So the history of Florida tourism reveals social issues that impact us today. Okay, to clarify that a little bit better, that would become social issues that impacted the development of Florida tourism continue to impede equal access to recreation today. It feels like a lot, but it's actually a much clearer thought, and it tells us exactly what this exhibit is going to be about. Your big idea doesn't have to be written anywhere in the exhibition. It is for you as curator, as developer, to help guide your object selections, your interpretation, and everything you do. It helps make it a lot easier what you're going to select to include and what to leave out. So big ideas are really hard to develop. I recognize that. Sometimes you start with one big idea and you keep evolving it throughout the process. Themes and goals, that's much easier to develop. So I like to use this chart from Beverly Sorrell's ebook, The Big Idea, to kind of help identify which is which, because sometimes it gets a little hazy over what really are we talking about. If your big idea is about your institution, that's not a big idea. That's not really an exhibition. That's your institutional statement, your mission statement. What the exhibition will accomplish, that's your goals. The one all the way at the bottom is really the one I think we get stuck on the most, is what the exhibition is about, right? What's the content? Sometimes we already have like a catchphrase we like to use. That's really a marketing statement. That's for your public relations people to tell other people about your exhibition. So once you've developed your big idea, and remember, it can still be refined, it's not set in stone, you need to select your materials or curate. Even though curate gets thrown around a lot in today's society, exhibitions do actually get a real curator. You're going to want to stick to the essentials. Don't add items that don't add to the story. You want to present fewer choices that focus on what you must have to tell that story. Be really concise and deliberate in your selection. Consider how those objects fit into the story. Is it a primary focus, a secondary focus? Is it a must-have? You don't want to overwhelm your visitors with too many things that then they gloss over what you're trying to tell them, or they just try to speed through to see everything. Don't choose items solely on visual appeal, but rather choose an item for its information, for the story advancement. An interesting story can be more engaging than a pretty item. In the libraries and archives, a lot of times curators really want to select the one that is prettier, the one that's more visually attractive, the one that's colorful, because that's what our eyes are drawn to, and we forget about the primary story. Also in libraries and archives, it's real easy to get overwhelmed because the majority of items we have are books, manuscripts, words. And so then it becomes really easy where we're like, oh, but we have a one object, let's include that object. Or, oh, this book has a really nice dust cover, book jacket, or it has a color illustration. But is that really the best thing to advance your story? So if exhibits are stories, then the interpretation is the script. And many exhibition designers refer to the entirety of labels as an exhibition script. Here you have a tweet by Erin Blasco, who is a social media strategist at the Smithsonian Institution. And Blasco states, "I'm reading the best exhibit script right now. Even as a Word doc and not some fancy virtual experience, it's just amazing. It struck me because if well done, an exhibit script can truly be so engaging." And then when asked what she loves about it, her response is that it has super short, provocative sentences that myth bust, followed by a robust paragraph that tells the real story or explains that the real story isn't really knowable. It's good, it's memorable, it has variation, it flings what you think you know right into the sky. Blasco did not share the script publicly, but from the description, we know it's an ideal script. And I'm jealous because I want to read it. I want to know what's so great about this exhibition and take notes. But it's really what we should be striving for, that just that story is engaging, and then the items are illustrating that story. But where do you start? How do you approach that script development? Getting those first few words on the page is always the hardest. You know, we know that from any kind of writing. Just getting that down is difficult enough. And so exhibitions should have both identifying labels and the interpretive narrative labels. And the interpretation should really be all of these things. It should be conversational. Reading it should not feel like you're reading a book, shouldn't feel like you're reading an academic article. It should be polyvocal and include multiple perspectives. That doesn't mean you have to make room for every narrative or everybody's voice. It should be accessible, both visually and intellectually, for your audience, and not just your colleagues, not just the 5 other people who know about this subject matter. It should be decentered, giving all people, especially those traditionally oppressed and excluded, equal consideration. And it should be open source, meaning that the writing is sharing the authority with creators or audiences. Traditionally, curators were seen as kind of the ultimate authority sharing information, but we know that's not the case, right? Everyday people, our visitors, have very valuable information. Their life experiences are valuable. So we should be sharing that authority with each other. And then remember that interpretation is more than just a list of facts. It's everything else. It's that story. So overall, your interpretation should be inclusive. Who or what you're centering in the interpretation. Also, by definition, that means who are you excluding? This guide for more inclusive interpretation you see on the screen comes from Seema Rao, who is a museum professional and visitor experience expert. It provides guiding questions and general topics to help shape your interpretation. Remember that no matter what, your interpretation should always directly relate to that big idea. I really like this quote, so I always like to share it when thinking about exhibitions. Cheryl Mazzaros, Twyla Gibson, and Jennifer Carter wrote in Interpretation and the Art Museum, Between the Familiar and the Unfamiliar. They say, if presence has been privileged over absence, what happens if we start attending to absence? Think about this. What if your label addresses what is not in the photograph, not in the book? What if it talks about who is not in your archive? And instead of the first to do something, the superstar in history, we talk about the people who were not included in the frame, the everyday individuals that small acts change things. How does that change your exhibition? And how does that change a visitor's understanding of the story? So going back to the programmatic approach, labels are one of my favorite things. I wrote an entire style guide for the UF libraries so I could focus on labels. And style guides are something that we often see in publishing, especially in newspaper and magazine publishing. You may be most familiar with the AP style guide or the New York Times style guide. So I made one for us for exhibitions. I find it particularly helpful when coordinating exhibitions across multiple spaces and buildings. It helps to standardize choices and defines label types and length. The bulk of the style guide does focus on labels, which I feel are really necessary to transform displays into exhibitions and relay narrative and interpretive content about items. Labels are really where the curator tells that story and communicates with the public. So these are my guiding principles for labels. First and foremost, write for your audience, not your colleague. Write as you would speak. Write a story and not an annotated bibliography. Engage with the object as it relates to the big idea. Ask questions and admit unknowns. It's okay that we don't know something. It's okay that something is not documented. That's fine. And then the hardest one for everybody, be concise and limit your word count. So interpretive labels, the introductory, group, and caption labels, tell stories. They're narratives, not a list of facts. And they're not the synopsis you would find on a book jacket or a collection description. Interpretation should strictly align with the theme, the big idea, and be as direct as possible. There's not really a lot of room for being vague, having visitors read between the lines or make assumptions. You want to be straight and to the point. Writing as you would speak, you want to avoid any kind of extraneous, repetitive information or kind of industry jargon that you could use. More lengthy interpretation can always be included in handouts, brochures, exhibition catalogs, or even on websites. Your writing should really be conversational with just enough details to tell the story. Again, you want to avoid any kind of specialized terminology or anything that requires a really lengthy explanation. Exhibition interpretation is not for your academic peers or colleagues. or the other experts in your field. They're for the public. It's whoever is visiting your institution and coming to your spaces. And although there is a hierarchy of information in labels, they may not be read in that way by your visitors. If your exhibition requires reading the introduction or going in a certain order to understand the full exhibition, you really should consider revising all of the interpretation to distribute those ideas throughout as they relate to specific objects. So people who maybe don't read everything or don't go in the order you intend them to can still get the full experience of your exhibition. And you'll notice that I've also specified label length in order to help curators really edit their text to be as concise as possible and relay just the important points. This minimizes competing text next to objects, and it's another way to make your labels stand out from the textual objects presented. It helps break up the amount of reading that a viewer has to do, and it becomes less intimidating. Of course, when writing labels, language matters and language is important. Our choices for words mean things, so remember to be intentional with your word choices. I love this chart for family inclusive language from Margaret Middleton, who provides guidance and suggestions for more thoughtful inclusion when referring to families. Now, they wrote this while working in a children's museum, so that is why it's very heavy on the family. But thinking about terminology in that way can really benefit us in all types of exhibitions. If your exhibition is multilingual, I'm always a big fan of making everything as broadly accessible as possible. And so many languages, if your visitors may speak multiple languages, can be a challenge as well, because now there may be even more text that needs to be displayed because you have the item with text, the interpretation in maybe 1, 2, 3 languages. So when you're writing text, especially for multilingual exhibitions, you're going to want to keep it extra short and extra to the point. The image you see here, I don't think was particularly successful, but it was one of an early attempt at including multilingual text in an exhibition. I've also seen it done more recently where there's a QR code you can scan to then access other languages, and that kind of eliminates the extraneous information, and as well as having to print even more labels. So thinking about that, about displaying textual documents and pages filled with rows of text where it may not be obvious to the viewer which part or which page to read or what's more important. Another way to think about how to help your visitors is how your display is physically set up. In the image here, you see that the items are elevated on a platform and the labels are all physically separated. So I understand that redesigning vitrines and cases is not an immediate solution. And in fact, it took me, I believe, 4 years to convince administration that this was something we needed to do. But think about other ways that you can visually separate your labels from your objects to kind of help distinguish it and make it easier for your visitors to engage with the items. Thinking about your final exhibition, whether that's in person or online, I want to very briefly talk about universal or inclusive design and accessibility. So in its most basic definition, universal design is the design of an environment so that it can be accessed and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age, size, ability, or disability. Universal design is not a new concept. It's not a trend. And then accessibility, which is a part of universal design, is the things we do specifically to include individuals with functional differences. For exhibitions, it is not just physical accessibility, but also intellectual accessibility. It is making your text and interpretation easy to read and understand. I'm not going to read all of these, but the primary principles of universal design, and really universal design can be applied to everything from your building, to your text, to your objects, to your exhibition. So equitable use, flexibility, intuitive nature, perceptible information, low physical effort, and tolerance for error. All of these things help to make a much better experience for your viewers and visitors because you have a wider variety of viewers in mind. These are a lot of things to remember and keep in mind. So I like to use this chart from the Boston Museum of Science that is a really great reference guide. And I keep it printed in my office so I don't have to memorize all of this. And when I meet with a curator, I can just point to it and show why text should be printed at a certain size. Why is it easier to view white backgrounds and black text? You know, how does a wheelchair maneuver around our vitrines? You'll notice that this includes a lot of things that can be very useful, down to even what type of fonts to use, what are more easily legible for visitors. And then utilizing those principles of universal design in exhibitions, in particular for labels, before printing and before installing, kind of ask yourself, is the font size appropriate for viewing distance? You know, do viewers have to stand very far back? Is that text going to be too small to read? I have bad eyes, I wear contact lenses, so a lot of times I'm like, oh, that's really hard to read for me. We're going to need to make that bigger. Is there an easy to understand hierarchy of information? Is there enough contrast between your text and background? And for the most part, the easiest thing to do is to have white paper with black text. And then once installed, if it's under glass, are there a lot of glares or shadows that make it hard to read or see your items? Remember that less is more for your labels and your items on view. So don't crowd your objects and give your viewers kind of visual resting spots so that your items can really be showcased. Similarly, when designing for the web, keep in mind, again, the information hierarchy. Does it make sense when it's read by an assistive device? Are headings nested and identified properly? Does the reading order align with the visual order? Is there adequate contrast between the background and the text? Is it actual text or is it an image of text? Is the font size big enough? Are the hyperlinks, if you're linking out to things, are they easily recognizable? And are you using more than color to identify content? Do you use alt text for images, again, to help with those assistive devices? And this can feel like a lot of little things to consider, but the outcomes will always make for better exhibitions when you're designing for a broader array of visitors. It also becomes a habit to consider these things, and you start noticing how many things around us can really be improved by implementing some of the principles of universal design. So one of the last things to consider is color choices, right? Colors are really important and play a key role in exhibitions and accessibility. There's several online programs and color simulators that assess colors and contrast and can help improve designs. So sometimes what I may see is like, oh, I can read that even though I have bad eyes, but my bad eyes see a different kind of bad. I can't see from far away. My color distinction is fine. So having a computer program be able to tell me, yes, that's enough contrast, or no, that's not enough contrast, is really helpful. So things like Adobe Photoshop has a feature, Adobe Colors also has a feature, and you don't have to have a Creative Cloud subscription, so it's free. There's coolers.co, there's WebAIM, there's a lot of different systems out there if you just search online for contrast checkers that can really help you make those distinctions from the beginning. So the question I usually get at this point is, okay, but what do I use to create the online exhibition? And I don't have a good answer. And the reason is it really depends on what resources you have available to you in terms of software and collaboration and support. Over the years, I've used all of these tools shown here. I've used basic HTML. I've used the popular digital humanities tools, and some are easier to use than others, and some require you to install them on your systems. Some are completely web-based. All of them have their plus and minuses, and you really need to kind of evaluate what you have the capacity for at your own institution and what you're comfortable with and what the learning curve is. Every platform is really going to have various benefits that you can use, but if you think about kind of the basics that I've discussed here today and then implementing those, you can maximize each of these tools. So every exhibit's going to be unique. Every space is going to be unique. You're never going to have a perfect exhibition, but I hope that maybe now you're a little bit more confident in your approach and you feel a little bit more skilled in having these discussions to present better exhibitions. So thank you. I am open for questions.
Thank you so much, Lourdes. I'm going to stop recording.